So Bernie Sanders supporters spoke about who their second favorite choice would be for president. Now, I find this absolutely fascinating. We've kind of struggled with this a little bit on this show. There is some competition up there for the second spot. And Emma Vigeland asked this question. She's with Rebel headquarters of TYT. This is at the first Bernie Sanders rally in Brooklyn when he officially launched his campaign. Let's see what all of them say.
We're here on a beautiful winter day in Brooklyn. It's the beginning of March, and Bernie Sanders is kicking off his presidential rallies here in Brooklyn, where he's from. And I wanted to talk to supporters about how they feel about the fact that a lot of these presidential candidates, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, seen as more centrist, have adopted Bernie Sanders' supposedly radical policies that he introduced in 2016. Hillary Clinton famously said that single payer would never ever happen, and now a great majority of the presidential candidates have endorsed his Medicare for All bill. So why do they still support Senator Sanders over some of these other candidates?
I feel that they're just careerists, and they're taking advantage of how the overall progressive wave in America. Booker and Gillibrand and Harris, they're more like centrists who are just like riding our left wave.
There are a lot of candidates that are promoting the same agenda, but what I like is that he's the one that was pushing this agenda in the first place, and this progressive agenda. So the fact that he's such a principled leader and that he's been fighting for the things that he's been fighting for since his childhood and since his, teens and since when he was in college, that's what makes me trust him and believe that he's going to be taking that forward into the future.
I think a lot of Democrats actually felt the shame of being called liberal progressive, and Bernie has single-handedly in many ways made that discourse not only acceptable, but something that a lot of people are pursuing and accepting and demanding.
I also just think a centrist can't win, so even if Kamala is saying she's for healthcare or whatever, I just don't believe it. Centrists can dress up however they want, they're not going to beat Bernie.
People want to talk about how he's so old and that he's too old to be president. Well, we tried a president who had no experience. Why don't we try one who has all of it?
He was for legalizing weed back in the 80s. He was against the Iraq War. And he has been against, pro-Wall Street reforms since the 80s, too. He has not changed.
He believes in this stuff rather than just supporting it for political reasons.
And I think he's genuine and honest and passionate about everything that he talks about. And it's been clear from the start of his even political journey in general what he stands for. And he's one of the first people to revolutionize stuff like this. So it's really important to support him.
Everything that he's talked about in the past, he's still talking about now. And everything that all these new progressives are coming out with, I rarely ever heard them say anything about that until they started their run for presidency or a little bit before.
Where were they at 2016? They didn't even back Bernie Sanders. They all back Hillary Clinton. So now the progressive movement coming 2018, all of a sudden Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, all of a sudden now you want to be progressive?
If it wasn't Bernie, who would you support for president?
I don't know. I would have to think about that.
Liz Warren.
Yeah, I think Liz Warren's the only way, yeah. I mean, even if she is a capitalist, at least she is truly for these positions.
The only one I do like is Tulsi Gabbard. That's it.
It would have been Elizabeth Warren without a doubt. But when she backed Hillary as quickly as she did, it was very obvious that she was backing a winning horse and not what she supported.
I'd support Elizabeth Warren. I think she's the second most progressive candidate out of the announced candidates, and her policy on Wall Street is second to none, maybe even better than Bernie's, but Bernie is a better general candidate in my opinion.
I absolutely love that video. Because you know what that tells me? It tells me that what we've been saying all along is correct, that mainstream media and a lot of these corporate centrist Democrats, they really talk down to the American people, and they really think like they're getting away with things that they're quite clearly not getting away with at all. So even though you have mainstream media virtually never talking about policy substance, you ask these young Bernie supporters their opinion on various things, and what do? They hit you with a bunch of substance. And, listen, one of them said Bernie was for legalizing weed way back in the day. Bernie was against the Iraq War. He was one of the few who stood up. Bernie has been fighting for Wall Street regulation. He's a principled guy. He stood on these policies, and he's been correct. Now, that's such a substance-packed answer, and that person didn't learn that from watching CNN or MSNBC. They learned it from doing independent research and actually caring about this stuff and following it and looking into politics for how can we fix our system, how can we make everything better, what policies make sense. And that video actually gives me a lot of hope because it shows me that sometimes I get scared that the massive amount of bullshit that's thrown at people from corporate Democrats and from mainstream media, that almost is an efficient diversion where people will kind of go down the rabbit hole with these nonsense fake scandals and silly arguments and whatnot, and they kind of forget about policy substance. But this video shows me that's not true. That, they're really keeping things in perspective and really evaluating based on the right metric. They're looking at it like, okay, who's the most progressive? Who supports the policies I support? Okay, that's Bernie. Who's number 2 on that list? And that was fascinating because here are the answers we got. Liz, and Liz, that's 4, quote, but she let us down. So, and then 1 Tulsi as well. Now, my guess is this. The more that a lot of those people learn about Tulsi Gabbard, the more it'll get closer to 50-50 between, hey, who's your second favorite? Maybe about half will say Elizabeth Warren and half will say Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard is the victim right now of not having enough name recognition. Now, you probably know her because you listen to this show and you're a political junkie, but there are many people out there who are even relatively politically educated and they still don't necessarily know Tulsi Gabbard, or if they do know her, it's tangentially and it's not super specific in terms of what she represents and what she supports. So my guess is the more people learn about Tulsi Gabbard, the more that'll go more to about 50-50 between Elizabeth Warren and Tulsi Gabbard. And listen, that really reflects what we've been saying on this show. I've often been saying, okay, when we do ranked choice voting, how would we do it? Obviously, number 1 is Bernie. I think there is a question between Elizabeth Warren and Tulsi Gabbard because Elizabeth Warren, you could take a lot away from her in terms of, like, she's weak on foreign policy. She voted for Trump's bloated military budget, which is just an offense budget. She has a bunch of questionable votes, but on Wall Street, she is by far and away the second best and very strong, and she's been pouring on a lot of interesting new policy ideas and substance recently, like the wealth tax, 2% wealth tax. So I think on tax policy, I think on Wall Street policy, Elizabeth Warren is super strong, and she's putting that front and center. Now, it's not to say Tulsi doesn't believe in those things, but it's not front and center for Tulsi, so you don't know exactly how much you would prioritize it or fight for it. Tulsi's big thing is ending the U.S. empire, and I don't doubt her sincerity on that front at all. And in every interview, she's hammering away on these incredibly substantive talking points, and she stuck her neck out on Venezuela and a bunch of these other issues, and on Syria, and she's been smeared relentlessly for it. And Tulsi has the anti-establishment appeal of supporting Bernie Sanders and basically putting her own career on the line in a way because she stood up and stuck her neck out and said the DNC is not treating Bernie Sanders fairly, and she's been maligned by corporate media for a long time. So she has more anti-establishment bona fides, however you say it. And she has more anti-imperialist and non-intervention. She has more credit on that front. But Elizabeth Warren, you could give her the edge on, creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and Wall Street regulation and a bunch of this stuff. So for me, I'm going to have to do a real thorough analysis to get down to, and you got to look at it scientifically and you got to look at it mathematically. Here are all the policy positions. And where do I agree with Liz more or Tulsi more when you look at the totality of their policy positions? And then also, one of those people made a great point. You do have to deduct from Liz Warren because, listen, she did let us down. And I think that answer nailed it because she said, well, obviously she was playing politics because she didn't back the person who she wanted to win, Bernie. She went with who she thought was going to win. Now, I understand the logic of that. Elizabeth Warren can argue, yeah, but we all were convinced that Hillary was the one who was going to win, so I didn't want to back Bernie and then destroy any chance I have of influencing the Hillary Clinton administration in a more progressive direction. So I actually get that argument, and it makes sense. It's like playing Machiavellian politics to actually try to get progressive policy implemented. So you can excuse it to a degree, but ultimately when Bernie Sanders ended up losing Massachusetts by the slimmest of margins and Elizabeth Warren sat on the sidelines and didn't endorse the candidate who we know she agreed with more, yeah, you got to go, well, come on, why aren't you just Why are there multiple layers of analysis? Why can't you just say, I agree with this guy, I'm going to go for this guy because that's what a principled person does? And it was unprincipled. So anyway, Bernie number 1, then you have a debate between Elizabeth Warren or Tulsi Gabbard at number 2, and then when you get to number 3, you probably go Andrew Yang, or at least I do. He's putting UBI front and center, and he supports Medicare for all, even though he has some questionable stuff in terms of regulation, in my opinion. And then, I don't know, from there on, it requires a hell of a lot more research, but Pete Buttigieg is apparently somebody who's been running pretty progressive to this point. We haven't spoken about him yet on this show, but apparently when he was younger, he idolized Bernie Sanders, and that has influenced, his campaign now. So maybe him in what would that be? 1, 2, like the 5th place position. But anyway, bottom line is we don't need to get into the details of that now. There will come a time where I do a power rankings for you guys and give you guys my analysis on it. But I love the answers there because they're so correct. A bunch of them said, listen, the centrists who are now pretending to be progressives, that's exactly what it is. They're pretending. They're careerists. They're riding the left wave, and they don't really believe it. And they called them out by name. They said Kamala Harris, Kirsten Gillibrand, Cory Booker. I love how virtually all of those people were super educated on the issues. One of them was like, listen, the centrists can't win. They can't win. Now, again, this is with all of mainstream media and every corporate Democrat in the country screaming at them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the opposite, and saying to them, what are you talking about? A lefty can't win, a lefty can't win, a lefty can't win. Even with all that propaganda, they're like, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Only a lefty can win. They're so right, man. I really love that segment. But anyway, there you have it. It's a clear favorite at this point for who Bernie Sanders supporters would have as their second choice. That's Elizabeth Warren. But my guess is, and one person said Tulsi, but my guess is, as time goes by, that Elizabeth Warren-Tulsi divide will become more like 50-50. So it's Bernie number 1, Elizabeth Warren and Tulsi. At some point, my guess is it will be tied between those two. And that really reflects what we've been saying on this show, and I think that most lefties will probably come to that conclusion when they do the analysis.